Frustration with Oregon has led these 13 counties to vote to leave for Idaho. This is just the first step in Idaho's plan to consume parts of California, Washington, and this huge chunk of Oregon. Within just the past few years, the movement has grown rapidly, and this marks a bigger trend happening all across the United States. And yeah, believe it or not, this movement wasn't spawned in Idaho. So who's behind this and why? What would Greater Idaho look like, and is this actually feasible? Eastern Oregonians are frustrated with their lack of representation since the majority liberal government overshadows their smaller, more conservative population, and nowhere was this more evident than with the COVID-19 pandemic. You see, quarantine mandates led to remote learning and the shutdown of schools and businesses. It was this constant reminder to Eastern Oregonians that their needs and values did not matter in the eyes of a government that they haven't been able to choose for decades now. This prompted a wave of ballots to sweep the eastern counties. 13 of them agreed to the plan, meaning Phase 1 of the Greater Idaho movement is well underway. Phase 2 would consume even more conservative counties, shooting Idaho up to the third largest state. Since the official Greater Idaho website rarely talks about Phase 2 and admits it's optional when it does, I think it's safe to say that our focus should only be on Phase 1. If all goes to plan, 14 counties and parts of 3 others will secede and join Idaho. Oregon would only lose under a tenth of its population, but almost a massive 2/3 of its land. Idaho, meanwhile, would grow by 20% in population and almost double its land area, catapulting Idaho up to the 5th biggest state just behind Montana. Abortion access would become severely limited, marijuana would become illegal, the minimum wage would drop from $13.70 down to the federal level, and Eastern Oregonians would have to pay anywhere between 6 to 9% in sales tax but would generally pay less in every other tax. Despite these all being what the mainly conservative population wants, some of these things might actually become an obstacle to a future Greater Idaho. I'll get to that in just a moment, but first we need to know the 3 steps it would take for a Greater Idaho to become a reality. Step 1. County level support. A large majority of the counties in the proposed area for Greater Idaho has already shown their support for this plan, so we can check this one off. Step 2. State legislative support. Idaho's House of Representatives passed a bill in 2023 allowing discussions with Oregon lawmakers on moving the border. Considering this bill, the region's already existing political alignment, and the free land and resources that would come with a Greater Idaho, it seems like Idaho shouldn't be a problem. It's when we get to Oregon that things are more difficult. Proponents argue that Oregon should want to support this because it would relieve it of the financial burden of subsidizing Eastern Oregon. Meanwhile, under Idaho's policies, Eastern Oregon's economy would surge. Besides, why deal with the political gridlock that comes with having Eastern Oregon? Oregon generally doesn't support a Greater Idaho, and there are some issues with these arguments, but I'll talk more about that later. For now, let's just say that Oregon agrees, and we finally move on to the last step. Step 3. Congressional support. Although I couldn't find any sources talking about whether or not Congress would approve a Greater Idaho, I could realistically see the odds still being against a Greater Idaho even if the counties and states were in overwhelming support. For one, approving this would mean Democratic congressmen shooting themselves in the foot, since this would essentially give a precious electoral vote to the Republican Party. Transferring this much land to another state is sure to be a logistical headache, but probably the most pressing consequence would be this. Approving a Greater Idaho might encourage other secessionist or border-changing movements sowing instability. Congress could also be benevolent and listen to regional needs, but let me just reiterate that these are only my best guesses. The issue is, almost this entire movement can be broken down if you ask this one simple question: how does this benefit me? Working backwards, Congress, by approving this, would see no tangible benefits and only negatives. Moving down to Oregon, losing almost a tenth of your population and more than half of your land would obviously not be advantageous. And while, yes, Eastern Oregon is technically subsidized, losing it would still hurt state revenues and reduce the state's regional and federal influence. And for an unfortunate reason, while the Eastern Oregonians claim they cause gridlock, they just simply don't because of how outnumbered they are by the liberal majority, which kind of gets us back to the root of the movement. While this deal is admittedly pretty sweet for Idaho, some worry about the financial burden the new counties might bring. Despite what I said earlier about Idaho's economic conditions, surge might be an overly optimistic way to describe what would happen to the county's economies. More business-friendly policies might help, but factors like good infrastructure, population, education, skilled workers, and adaptation to change can drastically change how successful an economy is. Even moving down to these counties, there are still a lot of issues. Since much of Eastern Oregon is struggling economically, cannabis is one of the only ways they can support themselves. Ironically, it's Idahoans that are propping up this industry since they can't have cannabis at home. This isn't the only reason, but it's part of the reason why Eastern Oregon itself has a significant minority of people who are against a border change. Other reasons include losing the culturally significant name of Oregonian, access to abortion rights, healthcare coverage, infrastructure funding, and mail-in voting. Undoubtedly, this movement faces a steep uphill battle. But as to whether or not this is a good idea in the first place, I'll leave that up to you. These videos take a long time to make, so if you enjoy them, consider becoming a member. It helps keep me alive, and you get a bunch of perks like getting to watch videos early. Thanks for hearing my plea, and as always, thank you to my members and to you for watching.